Let's learn in this Lightboard session about IMDS Instance Metadata Service and how it could present a security issue when using AKS with managed identity. AKS cluster is a group of one or multiple node pools. Those are virtual machine scale sets where each VMSS is a group of virtual machines. Those virtual machines will have access to the IMDS that will expose an endpoint that is 169.254.169.254 that will expose some metadata information like the name of the resource group, the name of the resource, the name of the subscription ID, the tags associated to those virtual machines. And that endpoint is accessible only to those virtual machines and to the pods and running inside those virtual machines. This means all these pods will have access to that IMDS. Now when we use a managed identity, it will be exposed through that IMDS, and a managed identity actually will be used in order to issue an access token that will give the user access to some Azure resources, like for example here the ACR, the Key Vault, the files database, application gateway, and so on. And here is the dangerous thing. If you have a malicious pod in my AKS cluster, that pod will have access to this IMDS endpoint, and then it will be able to get an access token. How can we resolve this issue now? Here we can use a network policy like Calico, for example, in order to deny access to the IMDS endpoint. This endpoint actually is fixed, it doesn't change, it's a static endpoint, so we'll go just on the egress rules and we'll go to deny access to that endpoint. And then for the pods that needs access to this managed identity, we'll allow them access through using that network policy rules. Let's see how this works. So here I have an AKS cluster, and within that cluster we have one or multiple virtual machine scale sets, one or multiple node pools, and we have one or multiple managed identities attached to that to these node pools. We can view those managed identities if we go to the identity section within the virtual machine scale set, and then if we switch to user assigned, we can view here we have 4 managed identities. So that IMDS metadata instance endpoint is available to all pods within my AKS cluster. If here I go inside one of the pods, for example, and then I'll curl that metadata instance endpoint, which is 169.254.169.254, I'll get a response right here, a standard JSON file that will give me information about the node and the resource groups, the name of that node, the subscription ID, the virtual machine or the VNet or the name of the subnet, the disk ID, and the tags associated with that virtual machine. And note here one of the tags used is actually the Kubelet identity client ID. That is the Kubelet identity used in order to connect to the ACR Azure Container Registry resource. Next here, if I go to use that Kubelet client ID, I can use it actually to request an access token from that managed identity. So using curl here, I specify the endpoint for the IMDS, and then I specify here resource equal management.azure.com, and specifying the client ID, then I will get actually an access token. If I decode that access token on gwt.io, from here I will see some of the attributes for that access token, like the resource or the name of the subscription that this will give me access to. So now these managed identities, they have access to Azure resources. So if I take a look for this Ingress Application Gateway, which is a managed identity used to access and configure the Azure Application Gateway for my AKS cluster, note here its roles are contributor on the resource group or on the resource group. Yes, so within that resource group actually I have multiple resources right here. So I can use from this demo, I can use, if I take that MSI resource ID, which I can get actually from the Azure portal, I can use it in order to log in to that Azure subscription using az login --identity-u, then that resource ID. And note here, I'm actually assigned or I'm logged in as that managed identity. So this means I'll have access to anything that managed identity have access to. So if I do here az resource list, note here the list of the resources that this will give me access to. And remember that managed identity have contributor role on the resource group. So I can create and delete resources from that resource group. So here again the list of resource groups as in table format. So I can create resources, right? So let's try, for example, here AZ storage account create. So I go to create a new storage account, and yes, it allow me to create that storage account because I have with the AZ login actually. It will take an access token from that managed identity and use it in order to perform actions on my Azure subscription on my resource group. So then here, after creating that resource group, you see it right here created, and you can also delete that resource group. If I do here a Z storage account delete, so it will be deleted, and here it's not anymore available. So this is very dangerous actually. To mitigate that issue, we'll be using a network policy. That is network policy that could be applied by namespace, or it could be a global network policy that will be applied to all namespaces in my cluster, and by default it will go to deny access to that instance metadata static endpoint, and it will give access to only some specific pods specified by their labels. Let's go to deploy that pod. So here I'll use kube control apply so that those two network policies are deployed. And then next, if I connect again to that pod, and if I try to get or to request JSON from that instance metadata, now that request actually will be timed out. It will fail. And the same here, if I try to log in to Azure using that MSI resource ID, that request will fail. Okay, it will fail because it cannot have access to the instance metadata that exposes the managed identity access token. So all the resources that I have presented in this lab are available on this GitHub repository, where you will find the network policy and also the lab with all the commands that I have used. I hope this was helpful. Thank you.